Good evening. So my name's Rebecca Harkins-Cross. I'm a writer and I'm a lecturer in the creative writing program at RMIT. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation with Rachel Kushner about her latest novel, Creation Lake, which is presented by the Wheeler Centre and supported by RMIT Culture. Thanks also to our booksellers for this evening, The Hill of Content, who have copies of Rachel's books for sale at the back of the room, which she's also going to be available to sign afterwards. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional and rightful owners of the lands on which this event is taking place, and acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining us as well. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Creation Lake is Rachel Kushner's fourth novel in a body of work which has, as a recent review noted, shown a consistent interest in the politics of parallel societies, the compounds of expat Americans who oversee neo-colonial sugarcane plantations and mining operations in pre-revolutionary Eastern Cuba in her debut Telex from Cuba, what Rachel has elsewhere described as the liberated zones of abandonment populated by artists and criminals in 1970s downtown New York, and the contemporaneous autonomia movement in Italy that she explores in The Flamethrowers, and the community of incarcerated women thrown together in a Californian correctional facility where the Mars Room largely takes place. Each of these novels is also permeated by the rumblings of momentous, if sometimes short-lived, revolts against society proper. Her new novel, Creation Lake, orbits around a radical farming cooperative in rural France named La Moulin, whose members may or may not be plotting an act of eco-terrorism to disrupt the Ministry of Rural Coherence's planned megabasins, designed to leach and store groundwater into privately owned reservoirs. But like all Rachel's work, the novel is shown to be a pliable form capable of containing multi-layered ideas. In this instance, as wide-ranging as human prehistory and the Neanderthal genome, as explicated in emails from the Moulinard's cave-dwelling mentor, Bruno Lacombe, the erosion of subsistence farming amidst the rise of industrial agriculture, the afterlives of May 68 and the thought of situationist Guy Debord, after whom the Moulinard's leader, Pascal Bamy, models himself, and the murky business of espionage, as related by our narrator, an American agent provocateur sent to infiltrate the collective under the alias Sadie Smith, who comes armed with a pair of notable breasts, high-powered binoculars with US military-grade night vision, and a P-38 semi-automatic pistol. For all Creation Lake's political foresight and careful research, it's also a page-turning and riotous thriller that barrels towards what, if Sadie succeeds in her mission, will be an explosive denouement. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Kushner.
Thank you.
To kick things off, do you want to read a passage from the novel so people can get a sense, if they haven't read it yet, of Sadie's very distinctive voice?
I'd be happy to. Can you all hear me all right? Great, okay. Thank you for that very precise introduction and gloss of the novel. This is a very careful reader sitting next to me. About the, you mentioned the Ministry of Rural Coherence.
Yeah, I had to get that name in there.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a minister in the book. He's the deputy sub-minister of the Ministry of Rural Coherence, and his name is Pablo Platon. And he's kind of inspired by a real French politician, which has been obvious to people in France, where I just came off of a book tour, and that was kind of fun. That politician's name is Manuel Valls, who was previously the Prime Minister of France. And before that, he was the Interior Minister, which means he was the top cop in France. He runs the national police, and their police are nationalized there. And there's something about him that is sort of lends itself maybe to comedy, particularly the way that French people detest Manuel Valls. And so I'd had a fictionalized version of him at first, but then when I saw what was going to happen in the book and that Sadie is working for these contacts who are going to eventually ask her to neutralize this politician, I decided I just didn't have it in me to knock off a prime minister. So I heavily demoted him to deputy sub-minister. Anyway, all right, I was just going to read the opening of the book. Oh, it's upside down then. All right. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction, too, and especially smoking. Although it was likely, he said, that these noble and mysterious talls, as he sometimes referred to the Neanderthals, extracted nicotine from the tobacco plant by a cruder method, such as by chewing its leaves before that critical point of inflection in the history of the world, when the first man touched the first tobacco leaf to the first fire. Reading this part of Bruno's email, scanning from man to touch to leaf to fire, I pictured a 1950s greaser in a white t-shirt and a black leather jacket as he touches a lit match to the tip of his Camel cigarette and inhales. The greaser leans against a wall because that is what greasers do. They lean and loiter, and then he exhales. Bruno Lacombe told Pascal in these emails I was secretly reading that the Neanderthals had very large brains, or at least their skulls were very large, and we can safely infer that their skulls were likely filled, Bruno said, with brains. He talked about the impressive size of a tall's brain case using modern metaphors, comparing them to motorcycle engines, which were also measured, he noted, for their displacement. Of all the human-like species who stood upon 2 feet, who roamed the earth for the last 1 million years, Bruno said that the Neanderthal's brain case was way out in front at a whopping 1,800 cubic centimeters. I pictured a king of the road way out in front. I saw his leather vest, his big gut, legs extended, boots resting on forward-mounted foot pegs. His chopper is fitted with ape hangers that he can barely reach, and which he pretends are not making his arms tired, are not causing terrible shooting pains to his lumbar region. We know from their skulls, Bruno said, that Neanderthals had enormous faces. Wow. So think about faces, enormous faces. I pictured Joan Crawford, that scale of face, dramatic, brutal, compelling. And thereafter, in the Natural History Museum in my mind, the one I was creating as I read Bruno's emails, its dioramas populated by figures in loincloths with yellow teeth and matted hair. All these ancient people Bruno described, the men too, they all had Joan Crawford's face. They had her fair skin and her flaming red hair. A propensity for red hair, Bruno said, had been identified as a genetic trait of the tall, as scientific advancements in gene mapping were made. And beyond such work, such proof, Bruno said, we might employ our natural intuition to suppose that, like typical redheads, the Neanderthals' emotions were strong and acute, spanning the heights and depths. A few more things, Bruno wrote to Pascal, that we now know about Neanderthals. They were good at math. They did not enjoy crowds. They had strong stomachs and were not especially prone to ulcers, but their diet of constant barbecue did its damage, as it would to any gut. They were extra vulnerable to tooth decay and gum disease, and they had overdeveloped jaws, wonderfully capable of chewing gristle and cartilage, but inefficient for softer fare, a jaw that was overkill. Bruno described this jaw of the Neanderthal as a feature of pathos for its overdevelopment, the burden of a square jaw. He talked about sunk costs as if the body were a capital investment, a fixed investment, the parts of the body like machines bolted to a factory floor, equipment that had been purchased and could not be resold. The Neanderthal jaw was a sunk cost. Still, the tall's heavy bones and sturdy heat-conserving build were to be admired, Bruno said, especially compared to the breadstick limbs of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. Bruno did not say breadstick, but since I was translating as he was writing these emails in French, I drew from the full breadth of English, a wildly superior language, and my native tongue. The talls survived cold very well, he said, if not the eons, or so the story about them goes, a story that we must complicate, he said, if we are to know the truth about the ancient past, if we are to glimpse the truth about this world now and how to live in it, how to occupy the present, and where to go tomorrow. My own tomorrow was thoroughly planned out. I would be meeting Pascal Balmy, leader of Le Moulin, to whom these emails from Bruno Lacombe were written. And I didn't need the Neanderthal's help on where to go. Pascal Balmy said, go to the Café de la Route on the main square in the little village of Vendôme at 1 p.m., and that was where I would be. So that's the first chapter.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I should plug that Rachel also reads the audiobook, and I would highly recommend.
So if you want that annoying voice to continue for the next 11 hours, it's yours for whatever, $8.99.
So
No, I was kidding. I love reading. I love recording the audiobooks. It's actually a lot of fun.
Yeah. So all your previous novels kind of move through the perspective of a very wide range of characters. And while there's a similarly vast set of characters in Creation Lake, all of their stories are filtered through the eyes of Sadie Smith, whose own identity is kind of a hall of mirrors. She claims that she hails from a place called Priest Valley, which she describes as a beautiful non-place. This is just a name that one of many names that she's adopted on her missions. And as you kind of, show in that paragraph, she's not only relaying those things, but she's also translating them often from the French as well. I'm interested in how her voice came to you and why it was necessary for conveying this particular world.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, she tells the reader that she tells the people in the book that her name is Sadie. So she's kind of admitting to the reader that it's not her real name and that she just has this story that she's from Priest Valley, California, which, as she tells the reader, is like elevation 800, population 0. And that is a real place that I've passed through many times. And the population there is 0. I think it was settled at one point. But I always thought, that'd be like a cool thing to put into a novel. And she thinks that would be a cool place to use for, a bullshit backstory when I go to infiltrate a bunch of well-meaning leftists and get them raided by the police and essentially destroy their lives. So back to her. When I finished my last novel, The Mars Room, I pretty quickly turned to this idea of writing a novel that would be set in rural France, specifically in this central southwestern region that I happen to personally know pretty well. And I knew that it would be about a group of young people who decamp from Paris to set up a sort of subsistence farming commune with this idea of finding a way to escape the dictates and confines of contemporary bourgeois life and maybe live closer to nature and kind of try to escape the dominant paradigm and even escape, shall we say, capitalism, but by withdrawing to this rural part of France. And the area that I knew I wanted to set the book is a place where the French resistance was very active. I know, it kind of seems like everybody now claims they were in the French resistance or from a particular generation, but they really were very active in this area, and the Nazis came through there and burned everything. and killed a bunch of partisans. Before the 20th century, there's this long history of peasant revolts in this area, and this feeling that it's a place that has the fortitude to remain outside the metropole of Paris. It's a place where people even don't necessarily speak French at home. They speak Occitan and other Aquitaine languages. So I knew I was going to write this novel, that I was interested to write this book that took place in this area, and it was about a group of kind of young militants who want to learn how to farm and maybe develop relationships with the local farmers and live closer to nature. And the conflict would be that they're set on a collision course with the French state and raided by the police. And I got the idea for the book in about early 2009, which was a couple of months after a commune of people that we knew in the village of Tarnac in the northern Corrèze were raided by the French police. And I did think it would make an interesting topic for a book. I also knew that there would be this mentor who's a sort of anti-civilizationist, Bruno Lacombe. I knew it would be like an elder Frenchman who I thought of as like a refugee from the long 20th century, someone who'd been through May 68, who'd sort of given up on the idea of the, revolution starting on the factory floor and had moved to the countryside. And by the time the book takes place, I thought of him as somebody who feels quite certain that capitalism is here to stay. There's no revolution coming. He's not like a messianic, he's not waiting, and instead has this idea that he can leave this world while remaining in it. In other words, like transforming consciousness rather than the world around him. So what I didn't have was a person who was going to tell the story. It's very difficult to write a novel without a narrator. And it took me a while to figure out who she was going to be. I'm just not somebody who's drawn to autofiction. I mean, I read it sometimes. Other people are good at it. It's not my instinct. I was looking for someone who was unlike me, in part because I sort of have too much sympathy for this social project of building this commune and for this world. And so then if it's someone like me, what's the trajectory of the novel going to be? Probably sort of gradual disillusionment, which is like not that interesting to me. And I worked on the book, and I would just write little scenes here and there and descriptions, and kind of nothing was happening for like 3 years. And then suddenly one day I wrote those 2 lines, which are the first 2 lines of the book that I read just now, and I realized that they were being transposed by someone else. It wasn't Bruno merely writing them, but this second voice, this woman. And then by page 3, it was like an enemy had entered the scene and was coming to town and was going to get these people raided and shut down their commune. And it was almost like a dissonant horn section in a symphony, like, oh my God, And it should have been more obvious to me than it initially had been to choose a narrator who, just to summarize her, is a disgraced former FBI agent who was fired from her job for the FBI after she entrapped a young eco-activist in Northern California, and they fired her because their conviction was overturned, so they didn't get what they wanted out of her. And then she retreats into the private sector, where you kind of work in this shadowy, unregulated world for people she calls her contacts. She's never met them in person. There's some consortium, maybe, of people in the government and people who have mightily invested in industrial farming in the area where she's headed. So all of a sudden, it became logical to me to have a narrator who was one of these people that I'd heard about in real life, which had been infiltrating leftist activists since the early 2000s. And it's something that I'd kind of watched from the side. Like, her FBI story is pretty much directly lifted from real life. There had been a female FBI agent in Northern California who entrapped this guy, Eric McDavid. He was like a young guy, fell in love with her, and she was saying things to him like, if you really love me, you will show me that you're willing to throw away everything, even your future freedom, for this cause. Like, we need to build this bomb together to whatever they were going to do, blow up an animal testing facility. And he was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison. And he served 9 years before his lawyer was able to prove that this woman, this FBI agent, had entrapped him, and he was set free. And at the time, I had asked myself, like, what kind of person does that? I mean, beyond the rhetorical question that's implied by that, which is like, how could you do that? But more, what are the mechanics? Like, how does that person justify that sort of behavior? Because it's not coming out of a conservative, reactionary motivation, because she herself was the one who was introducing the possibility of political violence. So I had just watched that happen, and then there'd been a British undercover agent working for the Metropolitan UK. Maybe some of you know this story, this guy named Mark Kennedy, and he infiltrated leftist activists, climate activists mostly, in Germany, England, and France. And he'd infiltrated the people of Tarnac, who some of whom I know. And that had like blown up into a huge scandal for the UK police, because he had affairs with like 10 different women in these groups. And many of those women ended up suing the Metropolitan UK, and apparently some of those suits are still working their way through the system. He also countersued the UK police for, quote unquote, failing to protect him from falling in love. And like, this guy was such a case. I was told by people who were close to people who were there, it's like a couple people removed, that he was found out by the activists when somebody opened the glove box of his van and discovered passports that all had his picture, but several different names, and they cornered him to say, like, what's the story here? And apparently he started to cry, and he said, I'm with you guys now. I've come over to the other side. I don't know what to do. I'm in this trap. Everything is so fucked. I hate myself. I know you probably hate me too. I understand. And because they were like endearing activists who believe in others, they didn't beat his ass. And like a week later, he disappeared. And he was hired by the military contractor Blackwater. So that had given me this sense that there's life, after you work as an undercover agent, which is a dastardly business, really, especially if you yourself are an agent provocateur in a sort of classical sense you would think mostly would exist in things like spy novels, but I got it from reality. And so she kind of comes out of that and then uses those cases for the reader to address the folly and foolishness of other agents, which she doesn't consider herself to be. So she only has an affair with one guy in the commune.
I kept thinking about, there's that quote at the start where she says something about, like, the psychoanalyst reads the patient for signs of repression, reads their speech for signs of repression, and not only the things they're withholding from others, but also from themselves. And it kind of encourages the reader to read Sadie's speech in that way, to look for kind of cracks in the veneer of a very strong self-image she holds of herself.
Yeah, well, I mean, she says at one point in the book that she has no need ever to clean up her trash because she won't be returning to the same place twice. And to me, that retrospectively now is like a real crack, not just in the veneer, but in the existence of the person. I mean, I can't imagine how perilous and meaningless life would feel if there were no reason to proceed by an inner compass of ethics. It's terrifying, really. And she says that she has this boyfriend, Lucien, who she's connected, as she calls it, by cold bump. She just walks up to him in a bar because he's the childhood friend of the de facto leader of the commune, and they've been infiltrated by an agent who's kind of like Mark Kennedy. So they're understandably paranoid, and she needs an in with them. So she ends up in a relationship with this guy, and as she says, he's in love with a woman who doesn't exist. And then she's describing to the reader what it's like to be in intimate embrace with him, where he thinks that it's about two people revealing their inner self and the radical acceptance that is, sexual intimacy, whereas she's just coldly looking at him and wondering if she's getting paid enough to do this job.
You mentioned before not picking a writer as the narrator, and the kind of disillusionment that Sadie's voice brings. And a big component of the novel is the kind of day-to-day workings of these kind of intentional communities, which Sadie is always at the ready to point out the kind of internal contradictions of. The women perform all the child work and the men do the physical labour, but also the intellectual labour in the library. One of the members who's been excommunicated says that the leader, that everyone else treats him like a god. Some of the members have never been around the kind of working class white people that are the peasantry in this region.
Right.
Did you have any particular models that you were looking to as to how these kind of idealistic configurations play out in practice?
I did.
Yeah.
But I come from different sides of that. I want to convey truth in my novels. I mean, who doesn't? But I want them to be funny, and I see things from many different facets at a single time, and I think a lot of us do. And that's why you can sort of fan out and ventriloquize many different points of view in a novel, which isn't to say that there's no real meaning and everything is relative. I don't think it's the case, but things can have more than one valence, So she goes to she's at the commune, and she's being shown around by Pascal, the leader, and he takes her to the daycare and kind of advertises it as so we have a collective daycare, and, in the city, when you're just trapped with your bourgeois family, you either farm out the daycare to other people, or, the woman has to stay home and do it, and the nuclear family is stuck alone with their children, and here children can go to any adult in the commune as their, de facto parent, and parenting is less lonely because everyone's doing it together. People just volunteer and take shifts at this daycare. And Sadie looks at the two women who are sitting at a picnic table next to the sandbox, and they both look really pissed off, chain smoking and gossiping about something. And then there are a couple children in the sandbox throwing sand at each other. And as Sadie points out, flung sand has no momentum. So there's this world of frustration. And she says to Pascal, so these two women who are here today are not the mothers of the children who are also here? And he says, oh, well, those two women just happen to be the mothers of the two children who are here today. And have I witnessed things like that? Sure. But have I also maybe even participated? Have I cleared the dishes when the men were talking about social reproduction after dinner? I have. But what Pascal says back to her is we are not the first to discover that the gender division of labor reasserts itself in the commune form. And somebody has to oil and lube the trucks and build houses, and somebody else has to watch children. And I don't think anyone has perfectly solved this problem. And when it comes to social environments that are heavily reliant upon one or maybe a couple charismatic personalities, I think you find more dysfunction and more division in terms of the contradictions of what they say they want to, live by and what they actually live by. But when Sadie attacks these people in the book, I don't see her attacking them from a place of, for instance, feminism. If anything, she's kind of a misogynist, I think, in her own way. But back to, the cracks in her own facade, I think that it's important to her to trample on other people's dreams because she herself is about to get the dream, terminated. And so she's sort of saying nothing is sacred, at least initially in the book. She does start to soften later. And for those who haven't read it, one is given long breaks from her in the form of Bruno, who is really the heart of the book to me, and like a much less critical and more open individual.
And it's really through Bruno that those cracks in the veneer emerge most fully. At the start, she is taking his theories about human prehistory and what we've lost with the Neanderthals. He says that Homo sapiens, that the death drive is in the driver's seat with the species. And she sees him as a crackpot initially, but as the novel goes on, she kind of becomes quite endeared to his theories as well. Is there something, a kind of personal motivation, like that you think there's something that human prehistory has to teach us about the present day? Because that's the other thing about Bruno. He's always insisting that he's not a primitivist. He's looking to the past in order to understand the future.
Yeah. He says, no, I am not a primitivist, as if in a swift answer to a question or something. I mean, but he is kind of an anti-civilizationist. And I'm interested in these people in real life. I'd heard about this French philosopher who supposedly lives in a cave, but I know people who are in long email communication with him. I've never really figured out how that works, and I kind of just immediately took to the idea of making my own version. That philosopher's name is Jacques Communes, and he wrote a book called This World We Must Leave. And I really didn't model Bruno on Communes. I just felt immediately like I could make a Bruno, and he would have a sort of armchair philosophy and a set of myths, and would speak in a kind of sermon-like way where he feels like he has things to share with these younger people in the commune, and he's drawing upon his own biography, his own experience, even his own like deep childhood, his primal scene, and his screen memories. And it was really fun to write him. Part of it is that it's like he's a much more, to me, like classical figure of literature because he has a past, and it just sort of opens and opens, and I could see the whole thing. Whereas with her, the rule for her past was that she would only share stories of previous aliases, previous dissimulations, so that she's more like just an onion. There's just layers and layers. And with him, he has a genuine childhood, and he was an associate of Guy Debord, and he lost his entire family in World War II. They were killed in concentration camps. I had borrowed some biographical details from a person who was an associate of Guy Debord named Jean-Michel Mencion, and there was just like so many rich details in his memoir. And that's like the fun of writing, is suddenly you see that there's a synthetic form to deploy all these magical details. Like these people that Guy Debord hung out with were totally uneducated and had kind of washed up on the shores of Paris as orphans, and were drinking in the streets. And it's kind of like Guy Debord was fascinated by their source of knowledge, which was a kind of freedom, that they were totally outside of the society that Guy Debord wanted to stage a rupture from, because he himself was like from this high bourgeois family. Anyway, back to trying to answer your question about, I had started reading some like more recent research into prehistory, like after molecular biologists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and it seemed like they could pinpoint these different historical, within 5,000 years, like when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had made contact, as they put it, like by having offspring. I mean, I don't know if you call it contact. But and I started thinking, like, this is, maybe each person goes through this. When you get to a phase, it's like you're stoned all the time. Like, what was it like? And did they consider this other life form to be a different species? Like, was there, a sort of social ban on mixing? Or was Europe and Asia and North Africa simply so large, with stretches that might have been impassable due to mountains or desert or snow, that these people simply didn't know the other was there? And so I kind of got caught up in the mystery of that myself, and I started reading all these things. And then I would sort of have natural reactions to what I was reading. Like, you read that they refer to this one era as the Stone Age. And I thought, as Bruno professes in the book, since, I have an outlet through him, like, why do they call it Stone Age? They call it that because all that's left of these people is rocks. But that doesn't mean that these people were especially interested in rock or rock-centric, It's merely that the rest of their society has just been abraded and blown and washed and worn away by the Holocaust of time itself. So I had a lot of fun, I think, with him, just in terms of having a narrator who could think about this very deep past. I suspect, maybe I'm alone, probably, maybe not. I feel like there's something in this image of people who lived before the written down, people who lived 30,000, 40,000 years ago. There's this sense that they are like the ur-text of us, like the original people. And not just limited by this idea of Adam and Eve in a Judeo-Christian paradigm, but that there's some intimacy that we have with them because they are also, before growth, way, way before the agricultural revolution, before we kind of set down our backpacks and like went, phew, I'm staying for a while, And there's, I guess, Bruno has this idea, and maybe I did as well, that like those people possess some kind of knowledge that we've lost. And so his yearning is about, did they leave any clues for us that we could figure out how to decode? And I think there is some intimacy there. When you're in the Natural History Museum looking at the diorama, it's natural to feel closer to those mannequins with Joan Crawford's face than it would be were you standing in front of a vitrine of like Etruscan pottery, where it feels like an exotic culture that happened, that had its own reticulated language and customs and religion and rules. These people, we don't know what any of that was. We don't even know how they spoke, and so there's a way in which they're much more tabula rasa.
The novel's title appears in one of Bruno's emails where he's talking about those kind of very things when he's describing his transition from living in the family home to the barn to the stone hut to the caves. And he claims that down there in the caves, you can hear the human community in the earth, the deep cistern of voices, the lake of our creation. And he goes on, it takes years to learn how to listen, to differentiate, to adjust your inner tuner to a position on the atemporal bandwidth of the underground world. And I was struck when I was reading that it sounds almost like the state that the novelist has to enter into, at least sometimes. And I was wondering, especially you have often spoken about the fact that you see yourself as a writer who looks outward, but what kind of state do you enter into when you write fiction and you're kind of tuning in that way?
Yeah, no, that's beautifully evoked. I hadn't really thought of it as in terms of like that specific metaphor, but it does make sense. Inside of what he says, I had this image of a man putting his ear to the rock wall and thinking that he hears voices coming through like shortwave radio transmission, which was something I was really interested in when I was younger. I mean, that's totally obsolete now with the internet, but I had a shortwave radio and, would connect the antenna at night. I guess the the radio waves travel better at night, and you'd get this catalog that would tell you, at 2 a.m. you can tune in and hear an opera from Senegal or whatever. And I had this idea that Bruno thinks he's hearing these voices coming through, and they're the voices from earlier epics. And then at the bottom of that passage that you read, he says, he's kind of doing a roll call of all the different people that he thinks he can hear in the cave. And then he says, I never want to be stuck in calendar time again, because he sees it as so lonely and isolating. I mean, it's true that when you write, because I think I said, you ventriloquize all of the voices, for sure. I've always been really interested in the way that people speak. I like cadence a lot. I remember being interested in it even when I was very young. And when I was writing my second novel, The Flamethrowers, I had been reading a lot of Roberto Bolaño, and he'll have a first-person narrator, and then a second person walks into the room and starts telling a story, and then they'll just hijack 30 pages of the book. And I didn't know you could do that until I read that book, and so it heavily influenced or opened doors for me in terms of what I did with The Flamethrowers, which was just let people talk. And I felt like I had moved to New York City as a young woman and hung out in the art world and was surrounded by people who had a lot more to say than I did. And I didn't really think I would learn much by talking. So I just listened, which is sort of the way I position the narrator of that novel, as somebody who's watching people perform themselves on her. And it was deeply pleasurable for me to kind of hook into cadence in terms of how people speak. There's a character in that book who makes recordings of himself on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And then at a dinner party, he just plays the reel. When he's done telling stories, he just hijacks and forces his guests to listen to a recording of him on this reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I knew an artist who used to make these tapes, and he'd given me one of his tapes, and then I'd lost it. And so it was just the memory of the possibility of somebody performing and kind of going into these different voices that allowed me to produce that. And so maybe there is a way in which it's you have to hear the voice in order to make the voice.
So there was a section in The Hard Crowd where you talked about sometimes kind of being in bed at night and being assailed by all the voices of your past and kind of the people you've been that it reminded me of. Maybe I'll ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. Sadie, she says as part of her duties that she's become a kind of expert on the sort of revolutionary communities that she's trying to infiltrate. And she says that in Europe, none of them have managed to successfully overthrow capitalism.
Yeah, it's true.
And I'm wondering what it is for you as a writer that keeps drawing you back to these particular moments of possibility in history across these different places, which you don't necessarily show with kind of rose-coloured glasses, but there is a sense that these are moments where it's possible that we can imagine the world differently, that the world might change.
I don't entirely know, to be completely honest. I mean, with this book, it is an extremely personal book for me. I mean, maybe all novels are, all mine are, but this one in particular my family's wrapped up in it, even. And it includes, in a way, people I know. I mean, someone came to my reading in Seattle and said, I'm in the book. Because when Mark Kennedy infiltrated Tarnack, he also attended this meeting in New York City in Times Square with a bunch of people and tipped off the Canadian, the French, and the American police that there was subversion being plotted, but he was the one who was plotting it. And there were charges that resulted from that. And the when the prosecution, they have to hand over their evidence legally to the defense, it's called discovery. I knew somebody who was facing charges from that and had the discovery and showed me this PDF that had photographs in it of people I knew walking through Times Square. And it's cool looking guys. It's winter and they're wearing, what are those jackets called that have the fur on the hood? Like scuba jacket. Mm-hmm. And they have no idea that police are taking pictures of them in profile with a telephoto lens. And it was just amazing to me to see that. And then as I was writing, suddenly the occasion arose. That's how the unconscious work. It's just it's like the dental assistant handing the surgeon's assistant handing the surgeon the tools. Your unconscious is handing you the image. And there I described that photo, and it's in Sadie's dossier, and she's looking at it very coldly, whereas I was going, oh, wow, this is serious, So I draw from life as I know it, and my son knows the caves very well in France because he grew up going in them at camp, and then he was a camp counselor the last 2 summers, bringing kids 3 kilometers underground where they have to wade through neck-deep, very cold water in wetsuits, and they have found resistance, graffiti, and some of the details that I borrow for Bruno are from my son. Bruno says there's a cave whose walls are flocked in magnesium crystals, sparkling white so that it looks like snow. And that was my son who had told me about that cave. And just in terms of the social project of the commune, I know many people who've been involved in leftist politics, I guess specifically of a generation that I would describe as having been sort of shaped by the anti-globalization movement of the early 2000s. And, and then people get disillusioned, and some people just go in the exact opposite, or it turns out they were a cop all along, and people have strong feelings, and they say one thing, oh, these are my best friends, this is replacing the family, abolish the family, and then the next thing you know, they're a Mennonite, and I myself still feel positive and hopeful about some kind of change, and someone like Bruno was really appealing to me because he says, capitalism is more supple than we are, and it's here to stay, and also human life is holy, and the human community has meaning, and life should be lived with dignity in a social round. And so it was very healing and reparative for me to have a character like that. And in terms of her, I felt like the book, not to give too much away, it doesn't exactly end with her being converted or good, but it's a trajectory that moves from experience to innocence, as I see it, rather than the reverse. But I really wouldn't know what to say about how it fits in with all my other work vis-a-vis what my interests are. I just don't have clarity on that.
Yeah, that's okay. That's maybe a good point for us to open it up to questions from the audience. So there are people with roving mics. So if you've got a question, please just pop up your hand. Yep, there's one in the middle.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
When French literature offers you so many wonderful potential targets for satire, why did you land on, or how did you land on Michel Houellebecq?
Right. Celine is in the book, too. So that's a great question. Thank you. I started trying to write this book in 2018. And, as I spoke earlier about the evolution of that, it didn't come easily in terms of how to execute the actual book. There were 3.5 years before I started to write it. And in those 3.5 years of searching around, part of what I knew was going to take place in the book would be a pitched battle between leftist activists and French farmers on one side and French police on the other. And then Serotonin by Michel Houellebecq came out and featured farmers on one side and French police on the other. And he comes by that milieu very honestly because he was trained as an agronomist. But still, I thought, Welbeck has scooped me and written a novel about the French countryside. And a friend of mine, really great Irish writer named Rob Doyle. Do you guys know Rob Doyle? Very funny writer. Anyway, he said, just put him in the book. And so that's what I did. But it kind of seemed like, but there's a couple other reasons for it. It seemed like it's just a cameo, right? He sort of just walks across the scene late in the book. And it seemed like he maybe would have been researching and writing serotonin exactly around the time of the summer that Sadie plots this kind of penultimate fiasco at the agricultural fair outside of Vendôme, where my book takes place. But I made up the idea that Welbeck would be friends with a French politician and be traveling there with this guy to kind of stage a, publicity tour, public relations things to get the farmers excited about the fact that their access to water is soon going to be taken away from them when all the water from the water table is sucked out and put into this mega basin, which they're now doing in France. And that had just barely begun when I wrote my novel, and by the time I finished it, there's like a whole new social movement in France, le soulèvement de la terre, like fighting against for the control of water and against the state. But I didn't know that Welbeck was good friends with the finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, which kind of comes out with his new novel, Annihilation. So I don't know. I just had fun with it. I thought, Welbeck is the most famous living French writer. You can find his books at like every gas station in France, like in the most remote area. And so it's just part of like painting in my parallel universe should glint with some of the features of this one. And he's one of those features.
Any other questions? You pop your hand up. Come on.
We can't just end with Welbeck.
I was interested in, when I was reading the book, particularly that strong voice and that wise, knowing humour. It brought to mind somebody like Dennis Johnson, and where you think that your novel now situates, particularly in his sort of spy area, and what that tells us now about how these areas are becoming more complex and more tricky and hard to define.
You mean in terms of genre?
Yeah, but also the issues that you're playing with there.
Well, I love Dennis Johnson, so it's flattering to have his name evoked. I love all of his work, but especially Tree of Smoke. And he flirted with genre some, like with you think of like Nobody Move, which I guess he wrote it was serialized originally. He's so wonderful with voices, too. And you can tell he loves people and is really interested in people. And so am I. If I had to say, like, what do I share with Dennis Johnson? I just think it's like a total love of people and their idiosyncrasies, and especially the way that those come out in their speech. In terms of genre, if you're asking about, like, having it sort of structured like a detective novel or a spy novel, yeah. I read all the novels, they're very short, of this French crime writer, Jean-Patrick Manchette, while I was working on this book. Like, I read them all in a summer. There's like 9 of them. And they're absolutely hilarious, explosive books from the 1970s that have a kind of wry knowingness to them. And like, Manchette was very informed by May 68. He's very political, but there's something not cynical, but like there's real black humor in the way that he writes. And his books are full of explosive action. And I've never really written that way. But I never had a narrator who was like, an agent of destruction before. I would have like a sensitive narrator who could, read the world around them and decode its signs. Whereas with Sadie, she's not at all interested in reading the world around her. She wants to put plans in people's heads and put guns in their hands. And I kind of took permission to do that from reading a lot of Manchette. And formally, it was illuminating and fun for several reasons, but among them, I realized even the most literary writer is resorting at some point to the cheapness of coincidence. And when you have a narrator who's a plotting dissimulator who thinks they have reality completely rigged, there's no need for any coincidence. Just in terms of how the structure of the plot works is quite different. I was also interested with this book in trying to pull off a kind of narrative propulsion that was sort of new for me. Like, the chapters are each about 3 pages, and I wanted to see if each chapter could kind of push the reader along, like push, push, push. It's like really different kind of tempo than a book of its exact same length where the chapters are 30 pages. It's, it's meant to be much quicker in a way, and maybe it was kind of playing with or borrowing some of the power of genre that gave me the permission to do that. But it's not like a noir novel, and there are people who are incredible practitioners of that, and there seems like there are sort of specific rules to the genre, and I'm really not following them by having Bruno pondering, the growth at any cost mindset of the Homo sapien as he rampaged across Europe 28,000 years ago. So I don't know what form the book is. A mixture.
We've probably got time for one last question. Yep, there's one at the front here. Or maybe so people at the back can hear. Yeah, thank you.
I hope this is all right to ask you. Do you mind talking about why you think you write, and also do you have the same process from your first book to your second to your third to your fourth?
Yeah, I know that there's comes a point in writing, for me, particularly in writing fiction. I do write all different kinds of nonfiction, but that's a different experience for me because I strangely know I can do it. I know it'll happen. It's just a matter of sitting down and working it out. But with fiction, it is something that you can go after but not grab. It might not happen. I mean, even after 3 novels, I could still find myself Googling, how do you write a novel? It's because each book is going to require a reinvention of the wheel. I want the form and the content somehow to fit together. And there's no way in which there's already a worked out methodology that I merely deploy. So it's new, and the ambition of that can be really exhilarating because it's an opportunity to finally not compromise, to make something new. With each book, that's how I see it. I get to start again and make a thing. And probably what I'm really talking about is idealization. You have an idealized version of what the thing is, and it's never gonna be that. Because as it makes its way into concrete form, it will naturally have to be something other than whatever you imagined in that placeholder in your mind of the ideal, perfect artwork. But in the process, when it starts going good, when I'm inside the trance of writing, I really feel like I'm having an encounter with my own unconscious, and I'm building a universe that's not this one. It's parallel, but it has textures of this one, but it shines more. It has some kind of hallucinatory envelope around it. And that is a deeply pleasurable place for me to be. Like writing this book in particular was really the most fun I've ever had doing anything. I don't know if I'll ever have an experience quite like that again, but I would love to.
That's probably a really wonderful place for us to end. Unfortunately, it's all the time we have, but please join me in thanking Rachel Kushner.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to the audience.